Welcome back, everyone, and I'm happy to introduce the next session. It's undergraduate student success, undergraduate student engagement and success. And the chair today is Beatriz Brando, Institutional Research Analyst at the Office of Planning and Analysis at UC Berkeley. Beatriz, take it away.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Igor. I'm honored to serve as the chair for this session today. Thank you so much to our presenters for all of their amazing talks. I think they've set us up for a really great discussion. So I'm going to start the session by having the presenters spend about 2 minutes introducing themselves and talking through a brief outline of their work. Then I'll start the discussion off with a few questions for our presenters before opening the floor to the audience for their questions. And just as a reminder, we ask that you please raise your hands in Zoom if you'd like to ask a question. I'll also be keeping an eye on the chat and raising up questions and topics that arise there. But both of these things will make sure that nobody gets missed, which I strongly like. So yeah, I think that's everything to get us started. So without further ado, Tongshan, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, thank you, Beatriz. Good morning and good afternoon. My name is Chang, Director for Institutional Research and Academic Planning at UC Office of the President. So my analysis compares undergraduate experience between first-year stop-outs and persisting students. So stop-outs are defined as those who left UC after the first year, but also responded to UQs. And persisting students are defined as those who continued to enroll at the campus after the first year, of course, also responded to UQs. So as you all know, UQs or CSHE is a very comprehensive survey covering many areas about student college experience. So I only looked at 6 topics, like academic satisfaction, academic engagement, belonging, financial concerns, perception on campus climate, and hours spent on paid employment. So these are, I constructed 6 factors, one on each of these 6 topics, used actually in total about 50 or 60 items included in UQs. So my analysis show that there is a significant difference of the first-year experience between stop-outs and persisting students. So stop-outs were significantly less satisfied with their academic experience, spend more time working on the paid employment job, were less likely to feel they belonged at the campus, were less engaged in academic activities, were more likely to perceive a campus climate negative, and were more concerned about their financial situation. So they also developed like hundreds of logistic regression models to look at predictive power of these different factors for persistence. So all these 6 factors are strong predictors, but among them, paid employment time, sense of belonging, level of satisfaction are stronger. Then I also actually compare college experience measured by about 300 to 400 items included in UQs. So I looked at a single predictors. So look at which are the strongest like single predictor among these 300 to 400 items included in UQs. So I found that hours spent on paid employment off-campus per week, I feel that I belong at this campus. Knowing what I know now, I would still choose to enroll at this university. I'm proud to be a student at this campus. My campus is a welcoming campus. Satisfaction with the overall academic experience. These single items in UQs are the most and the strongest predictors for first-year persistence. For example, if they strongly disagree, they belong at their camps. The persistence rate is at some campuses below 80%, which is actually about 20 percentage point lower than the average persistence rate after the first year. So this means the student experience matters in terms of persistence. So we definitely need to foster a sense of belonging on campus, change campus climate, so everyone feels deeply welcomed, inclusive, and respected. Help students solve financial problems so they can focus on study, inspire student engagement, and satisfy their academic needs and interests. Thank you, Beatriz. That's my summary.
Thank you, Tongshan. Let's pass it on over to Igor. Igor, if you could introduce your project and your team.
Sure. Thank you, Beatriz. I'm Igor Chirikov. I'm Senior Consortium Director and Senior Researcher at the Center for Studies in Higher Education at UC Berkeley. And I would like to present our study that tracks 10-year trends in student research participation. It also looks at the effects of the pandemic on student research participation and explores socioeconomic disparities in undergraduate research. And for the study, I've collaborated with a group of Berkeley students that participate in what's called Berkeley Data Science Discovery Program. This is one of the major efforts on campus to engage data science undergraduates in research with real-life data. And for the project that we worked on, we decided to merge together historical records, historical data sets from Zero Survey, because one of the advantages of the project is that it accumulated a very rich data set that is great to use. And I'm not sure I invited students to join this panel, but it's summer already. And I know that some of them are on this panel, on this talk. So maybe I see Jessamine is there. Jessamine, maybe you can introduce yourself briefly. I'm not sure if Sam is here, Sam 10. All right, maybe in a few minutes they can also talk. And Matilda were contributors. And if you watch the recording, they co-presented with me and they introduced themselves there. Again, it's summer, nothing you can do about summer. So just to give you a brief overview, so we look at student research participation between 2011 and 2022 and 2021. So it includes the data that was collected during the pandemic. We look at 7 universities, 7 research universities, public research universities that trace this question of student research participation during these years. And we look at 2 research questions. So first, how level of engagement in undergraduate research changed during this past 10 years. And specifically, we also look at how COVID pandemic affected student participation in research. And our second question is how persistent are socioeconomic disparities in undergraduate research participation over this 10-year period. So do we see that the gap between low income and upper middle class or wealthy student closes or widens during that years of observation? Again, it's very exciting to be able to look at the trends data. So what we saw from that analysis, and you can again access it in the recording, the study, the results show that the pandemic actually brought down the level of undergraduate research participation to the lowest level in 10 years of 10 years of kind of a zero observations. And this is, on one hand, it's expected, but on the other hand, I don't see it's kind of being widely discussed. We, in terms of the pandemic effects, we hear a lot about student learning, not a lot of kind of a student undergrad research. So that's an interesting finding, I think. And second, we see that there are persistent disparities in undergraduate research across this 10 years. And what's more worrisome is that the gap between rich and poor is widening during the pandemic. So we see these disparities exacerbate, and those disparities, they affect, among other things, the whole pipeline into the academic profession, and leading to basically less diversity in graduate schools, leading to less diversity in academic departments. And just one note on the practical side, what universities can do. I think the good start is to explore existing disparities in undergraduate research participation. And I really liked how one of the recommendations from our study actually repeated the recommendation from Kaitlin's study, because we also argue that it's important to create additional incentives for low-income and underrepresented minority students to engage in research. And I know, Kaitlin, you kind of you looked at it from the point of view of student-faculty interaction, but even research participation, to close this gap, we need to create additional incentives. So that's our study.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Igor. And perfect send up. So Kaitlin, why don't you introduce yourself next?
Teed me right up. Good afternoon, everybody from Raleigh, North Carolina. My name is Kaitlin Newhouse. I'm currently a postdoctoral scholar at the Belk Center for Community College Leadership and Research at North Carolina State University, where I manage and oversee a national climate survey for community college faculty and staff. But I was really pleased to share this work with you today, and in the video recording. That was my dissertation research that I completed last year at the University of California, Los Angeles. And I mentioned in the video that the motivation for that work came in some way from my own experience. I was a working class college student who found themselves at a private research university in the South. And I was not at all prepared for what the relationship with faculty was for, how it might serve me, until much later in my college experience, when some really stellar mentors stepped in and showed me kind of the value of that relationship and really put me on a course to go to graduate school and to sit before you all today. So, can't argue with the results, I guess. But so I was really curious to use this error data to see if there was a relationship between student-faculty interaction and poor and working class students' development of their cognitive skills. Some of the most important skills students get in college, right? Per Professor Brint's discussion earlier this morning, right? We want to make sure that students are reading, writing, and thinking really critically when they get out of college. And so my question was, does interacting with faculty help poor and working class students be able to assess those measures a little bit higher? And I used structural equation modeling and the 2018 data and found that in general, across all poor and working class students, that relationship did hold. So the more poor and working class students interacted with faculty, the more likely they were to rate their cognitive skills higher. And that was both a direct relationship and a relationship, indirect relationship that suggested that the more poor and working class students interacted with faculty, the greater their academic effort, their self-reported academic effort, which then positively impacted their self-rated cognitive skills. And the more they interacted with faculty, the more positively they rated the campus racial climate, which also had a positive effect on their self-rated cognitive skills. So clearly among poor and working, and that held for all racial ethnic groups as well. Because another motivation of this study I wanted to do was I wanted to approach thinking and studying poor and working class students not as a racial ethnic monolith, and I wanted to sort of see diversity and variation among them. And so I ran a model of all poor and working class students and then racial ethnic submodels. So since I found that interacting with faculty did have a positive relationship with students' self-rated cognitive skills, the question then becomes, okay, well, what are the types of background characteristics and experiences that get students to engage with faculty more or less frequently? And are there racial ethnic differences there? And I found that there were, and that interacting with faculty was not uniformly distributed across poor and working class students based on different identities. So I found that poor and working class women tended to interact with faculty a lot less frequently than did poor and working class men. This is a really interesting finding. We tend to see in the broader college impact literature, women interact with faculty a lot more than men frequently. So that was really interesting, something interesting there. And then when I looked at the racial ethnic submodels, it was actually the case that poor and working class white women interact with faculty at about the same rates as poor and working class white men, but poor and working class women of color, Asian American women, Black women, Latinas, interacted with faculty a lot less frequently than did men in those racial ethnic subgroups. So something really interesting there. And I think points to a place where we could have some really meaningful intervention, right? Those are the types of students we might want to use different initiatives to target specifically. There were pretty obvious major differences, like you might expect. Students in STEM majors interacted with faculty a little bit less frequently than did students in the social sciences or humanities. I think that's some mostly pedagogy stuff, and a bunch of other findings too. So overall, it was really a pleasure to use the SERU data to approach this study. The fact that the data set has a useful and nuanced social class measure really made it a pleasure to use. And then of course, measures of other identity characteristics and the student experiences really made it such a rich source. And it was a really exciting project to undertake. So thanks.
Thank you so much. Last but not least, Ana Maria, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself.
Thank you, Beatriz. I'm Ana Maria Carneiro. I'm a researcher at the University of Campinas, a public university in the state of São Paulo, Brazil. Good afternoon, good morning. And I presented the results of a survey that Unicamp applied in the first semester of 2020. And this survey was obviously the impact of the pandemic on teaching and learning. And it was inspired by the CSHE survey about the pandemic. We used some questions and I tried to compare some of the results. And many of the results were very similar. So the students in many countries were facing experience very similar, and obstacles and challenges also similar. I presented some results about the impacts on students' mental and physical health and well-being that were very impacted on these dimensions. They have a lot of trouble to adapt to the new online instruction. About the obstacles and challenges, the main obstacles were adaptive, as the CSHE survey showed, not technical. And most of the actions of Unicamp during this first moment of the pandemic were trying to solve technical problems, to providing infrastructure for the students, and not so much trying to solve this type of problem. When they were asked about their experience, most of the experience were negatively assessed, but despite the problems and this assessment, they were very satisfied with the overall response of the university regarding the pandemic and the transition to the online mode of instruction. And we also had some questions about if they had knowledge and use some Unicamp service and support during the COVID-19 pandemic, and many knew about the service, but few used the service during that moment. And at the end, I finish my video, my presentation, talk about the use that the administration did about this data. And I think now, looking back, that the timing of the survey was late, because when the survey results were analyzed, the administration already had made a big effort. So they had few new decisions or few new actions to do. It was that.
Thank you so much. So to kind of get us started, I have a few questions that I wanted to ask. And after we've kind of gotten the ball rolling, then I'll open it up to the rest of the audience for questions. So kind of to get us started at like a very high overview, what do you think are some of the most important ways that survey data can provide universities with a deeper understanding of student experiences and help them to better support their success? So what are we getting from surveys that we absolutely need and that we cannot get in other ways? And feel free to jump in.
Yeah, Beatriz, I can start. So I think based on our analysis, research in past 10 years, of course, UQs is, I think so far, the only source for us to understand student engagement, student concerns about financial support, like sense of belonging, etc. So these are all related to student experience. And based on our research, also my presentation, so student experience is related to a lot of things, persistence, graduation, overall, I would say related to their learning outcomes. Yes, we can learn a lot of things from like direct assessment, like their course learning, GPA, etc. So that kind of information cannot explain why students have difference in GPA in graduation status or persistence status. But the data from this survey can help us really explain what happened to different groups, to different students. I think that is, to me, the core value of this survey. So help us understand students better and create more effective services for students.
Yeah, I would just quickly add to what Tongshan has said, that in addition, the role of the survey data obviously is to capture some subjective experiences that students have, but it also plays an important role in institutional decision making, because this is probably the major way to address a lot of myths that are out there about student experience that they are all, students are all happy and engaged, and we see in the data that it's not. And also look at the disparities, because I think, and this is what I like about zero data in particular, the demographic section is so rich. You can look at disparities by a lot of student subpopulation, and with increase in enrollments, it's important to understand that students are very different. There's no like student who, people always imagine there's kind of a role model for students, and they always imagine kind of a traditional student. And we see in the data that it's not the case. There are many student experiences, and survey data is very useful in disaggregating that.
Great. So another thing I kind of wanted to briefly touch on is, as we saw in Ana Maria's presentation, and as was discussed in Igor's, and then as I'm sure was the case in many institutions, surveys early in the COVID-19 pandemic were critical in helping us to understand the student experience and inform campus responses. Now that we are very much hopefully getting to a point where we're past the worst of the COVID-19 pandemic, how should these results continue to inform our decision making? And how do we respond to a post-COVID world? And also kind of supporting, like, how does some of the stuff that we've learned even about survey taking during COVID-19 inform our practices moving forward? Anyone? Ana Maria, I'd love to hear your thoughts on.
Yes, one result that I think it's maybe a little different from the survey, it was that the lack of ability of the faculty to teaching in the online mode, and also the problems with the subject or the course content that were not very well adapted to the online mode. And so these results reinforced some measures of the administration regarding the teaching, training, and faculty support in course planning. But I think that this is a problem that maybe is previous of the pandemic. It was happening already. And the pandemic highlighted this problem, that we assume that the teachers are good teaching and maybe they are not so good. So I think one survey like that can show that the students are not happy with the teaching, the strategy used on teaching, and I think this reinforced the need of faculty training and pedagogical training and any other things. And it would be very nice to apply a similar survey now to see how the students assess this moment, if they think the scenario changing.
I want to add, so I use data obviously from pre-pandemic days, but it's been interesting talking about the findings of this study with folks and with scholars and with faculty in the field in a post-pandemic context, because a lot of my kind of findings and implications, as Igor alluded to and that you might have seen in the video, was that faculty might need to do a little bit more to reach out directly to poor and working class students. They might need to be a little bit more proactive to explain, like, what are office hours for? What kind of email decorum should I have with a faculty member? Like, you might have to spell that stuff a little bit out more. And it's been interesting. I've approached in sharing those findings and implications, I've gotten actually a lot of pushback in the last, I would say, like, year or so from faculty who are saying, like, we are extremely burnt out and exhausted and tired, and we're online all the time and nobody's cameras are on. Like, your findings and implications for this can't be that, like, we should do more, because lots of the folks, and particularly I think the folks who are talking with me and who are, going to professional development trainings and the like are the ones who are doing the most, they're working late and getting up early and all these things. But it's been an interesting environment in which to talk about student faculty interaction and to talk about the role of faculty and because of the post-pandemic conditions. And so something that I really try to emphasize with this work is that student learning conditions are faculty working conditions, right? So if we're not pleased with the rates at which students are reading and writing and thinking critically, or we're unhappy with some outcomes we're seeing, there is some onus on the faculty there to reach out, especially for marginalized students like the ones in my study, but also how can we create conditions that are humane working conditions that allow them to be really successful and set faculty and instructors up for success to be able to do that? And so I think in a post-pandemic context, that's been a different way I've had to sort of frame the findings, because folks are really tired and they are working really, really hard. And so it's given me a lot of food for thought in sharing.
Beatriz, I can also add one thought. So I totally agree with what Anna and Kaitlin said. So one thing, so we of course all learned from responses to UQs during the COVID-19 pandemic. Obviously, students experienced a lot more challenges, like engagement, as Igor just mentioned a few minutes ago, and in many other areas. So I think after the pandemic, universities should think about how to build a more robust infrastructure to support future learning, because we never know what will happen again in the future. Anything could happen. In California, earthquake could happen. So that will definitely have some influence on in-person teaching is central. So I think based on UQ zero severe responses on what we learned, so universities should think about how to develop a more robust infrastructure to improve student learning if anything like COVID-19 happens again in the future.
Igor, any final thoughts?
The rest of the panel. Just one thought. I think what the pandemic showed is that learning at a university and a research-intensive university in particular is so much more than your class or than your classes, right? And because we saw what happened with student experience, with basically the whole experience was limited to lectures via Zoom or discussion sections via Zoom. It's just we see that learning happens. The pandemic actually helped us to realize that learning occurs in many modalities when people are on campus, and extracurricular engagement, research engagement, and all other forms of learning that benefit students. And I think going forward is it's important to capture how that's happening in a more systematic way than maybe we did before, to understand better the value of education and the value of learning.
Great. Well, I have some more questions that I'd love to ask, but I do want to open it up to the audience more generally. So if you have any questions for our panel, please feel free to type it in chat or raise your hand. Cinnamon posted a question in chat to Tongshan, which I'll read out loud. Tongshan, I found your research question really interesting and have used UQ's data on my campus to address this question as well. Did you notice any patterns related to class level? For example, I could imagine that new students might have different challenges than students later in their academic careers.
Yes, Cinnamon, that is a great question. So I did not look at class level because for my analysis, I just included freshman entries. So two actual cohort, one was 2017, the other one is 2019, because we administered the UQs in spring 2018 and 2020. So I combined these two cohorts, which means that they are all freshman entries. So then look at after they took UQs or responded to UQs. And after the first year, did they come back in fall in the following year? So that was my study sample. Yeah, that is great. Definitely, I will look at how their first year experience would affect their graduation status. So that is something I will do, and probably look at different class levels as well.
Awesome. I see we have a hand up. Professor Brent?
Thank you. I wanted also to ask, or just throw something into the mix. It's related to Tongshan's research. We did a study several years ago of the students who were liable for dismissal because their grades were under 2.0 in their first term. And there were three variables that explain most of the variance. And they're a little different from what you expressed. And I'm curious about your thoughts about this. The three variables were being a male, high school GPA, and the high school attended. There was a real variation by high school, and not all of them were the lowest API high schools either. So this led me to think that, again, like many people are thinking, there's something going on with the men, but also that academic preparation is just a huge factor coming into the university. And we did control for a variety of things like social class and race and ethnicity, and still those are the variables that came up. So I'm curious about, how this relates to your research.
Yes, Steve, thank you for that. And that is a great question. So yeah, your actually results are the same as what I did before. When I look at the pre-UC characteristics, including high school GPA, gender, race, ethnicity. Yeah, this like high school GPA being male actually are strongest predict. But for my research, my analysis, I just focus on first year academic experience. So among those like 350 questions included in UQs, what are the most important items or factors that have a significant influence on their first year persistence? So a little bit different. I could control my analysis by pre-UC academic preparedness. Also, actually, I did control by student characteristics like race, ethnicity, gender, etc. But after I control these factors, are still very strong predictors.
Thank you.
Can I ask a quick follow-up question to Tongshan's study as well? I was wondering, like, in your analysis, you argue that universities need to do do better to address this kind of a stop out issue and help the students to continue their studies. I was wondering, what's the role of the surveys in identifying the students, and how would you recommend institutions identify the students before it's too late? Because basically you did your analysis when they left, and I was wondering if what's the way to prevent that?
Yeah, that is a great question. I asked myself again and again when I analyze UQ's data. Actually, in past 10 years, can we use response data for any prevention, or whether or not we can identify? Yes, we can. Actually, we can identify those students who would be likely to leave UC after summer, because we close our UQs actually in June or early July. So we know who actually strongly disagree that they felt they belonged at the campus. We can identify these students. But whether or not we can use responses to reach out to these students during summer to do something, I don't know. Campuses may have ideas how or whether or not we can actually use UQ's data for that purpose. So definitely, for example, some students spend like more than 60 hours per week on paid employment. So we can identify these students during summer. After our survey close, we close our survey immediately. But whether or not we could use that for any prevention, or we can reach out to them to provide some support, that is something I think our campuses or we can discuss further.
So if people don't mind, I actually had a quick question. So framing can often be so important when you're talking about equity gaps with student experiences. I'm kind of curious about what strategies do you all take when developing and reporting on analyses to avoid that the results don't get interpreted through a student deficit lens?
Yeah, do you ask the panel?
The panel, yeah, the panel generally, like if anybody has any thoughts on this, because I know this is something that I think about a lot when I'm thinking about when I'm talking about gaps, like how do you frame and how do you kind of avoid how do we avoid the student deficit lens that like crops up when we talk about, sometimes when we talk about equity gaps?
I think my earlier comment speaks to that, and perhaps a weakness in my strategy, but I tend to try to well, first of all, I was really mindful in this study. I knew kind of from the outset, I didn't want to compare poor and working class students to wealthy students. There's lots of data out there that does that and research that's done that before. We can usually pretty much guess what those findings are gonna be. I just simply was not super interested in sort of comparing poor to wealthy, like that's been done. But rather I was more interested in sort of understanding the broad variation among poor and working class students and exploring that a little bit further. So I think the extent to which you can do that rather than make some sort of comparative analysis is great. Recognizing that lots of times our policymakers, our board of trustees, et cetera, need to see some sort of demonstrated gap in order to act. So that's tricky. And I recognize that kind of bind folks are in. But then really for me, it was important when, with these findings to take the implications and sort of think about what the institution could do, and whether that's institutional agents like faculty, which I already talked about, there were some challenges there, but more broadly, what can institutions do? What can folks with institutional power do? So, one way one of the findings I had, right, is that we need to figure out a way to incentivize poor and working class students to interact with faculty more, and particularly to do high impact interactions with faculty like research, which Igor's project talks about, right? And so one of the ways you can do that research supports is to pay students to do those types of activities. Okay, well, how do we make sure that institutions are able to do that? You know, recognizing that there's not a lot of money flying around departments or just sitting unused. And so thinking about more broadly, even beyond the institution, right? So a lot of my other work in graduate school was on computer science, and the National Science Foundation over the last several years has taken a really hardline approach that if you're getting an NSF grant in computer science, but really more broadly, you need to demonstrate how that grant is going to contribute to what they call broadening participation, right? So if the NSF funds your study, how are you contributing to broadening participation in science? And that's, you know, recruiting and retaining more people who have been historically underrepresented in STEM in some way. And that can be all kinds of things, but it's a mandated part of the NSF grant, right? And so I think that's a really great example of how an organization with a lot of institutional power has changed the way that folks in STEM get access to resources, and is trying to incentivize and encourage folks to address equity gaps and reward resources accordingly. And so to the extent that we can not focus implications and findings on like, this is what the students need to do more XYZ, or we need to, you know, whatever the case might be with the students, but how can we use the findings and implications to sort of look up and out and try to figure out how to address some of the things that the data show.
Thank you so much, Kaitlin.
There's also a question in chat that I think about Kaitlin's study.
Great. Yes, from Cheyenne. Kaitlin, I really enjoyed learning about your student-faculty interaction model among different social class subpopulations of students. Were there any particular types of interactions with faculty that were more strongly related to increased self-rated cognitive skills compared to others?
Great question. I super appreciate it. So interestingly enough, I didn't look at the particular student-faculty interaction items in the CERU data set as they were necessarily related to the outcome variable, although now that you said that, I kind of want to, and that's super interesting. But something I did do that was really interesting to me was I did look at I ran some crosstabs on those different types of faculty interactions. And so for those of you that may be more or less familiar, the different items are things like contributed to class discussion, asked a question in class, communicated with the professor outside of class, sought help from an instructor when needed, those types of things, and ran some crosstabs on how frequently or infrequently poor and working class students were doing those types of things. And I did see some interesting patterns, which were that you know, poor and working class students reported fairly frequently having classes in which the professor knew their name, and they reported pretty frequently contributing to class discussion, but they reported a lot more infrequent rates of interaction in different types of interaction with faculty that are more around help-seeking behaviors, right? So they really infrequently were asking and saying that they asked insightful questions in class, that they communicated with professors outside of class, or sought help when they needed it. And so it was from those findings, as well as seeing some of the things that popped up in the structural equation models, that really led me to some of these implications, right? Of like, okay, how do we communicate to students what going to office hours is for? Or, you know, do faculty maybe need to be a little bit more proactive about explaining their availability and when they might be available to address questions, and that they want students to come. And if you come to office hours, here's the kinds of things we might be able to talk about. How can we incentivize a little bit more help-seeking behavior when students need help, so that, per the earlier discussion, like it's not too late and they're going to office hours when they have a D or need to drop out and get a W for a course. So that was really striking to me, that they're contributing to discussion. You know, professors know their name, but help-seeking seems to be a place that they're not as frequently interacting with faculty.
Can I ask a question? Kaitlin, I really enjoyed how your study had an implications for institutional research. And one question I have is, what do you think how we can improve, or in general, surveys can improve how we collect data about student social class for socioeconomic disparity? Because the current question is very broad, and although it differentiates pretty well across, the characteristics you would expect, but can you recommend us any good best practices in that area so that we can explore? Because every other year, we have so-called a design and content work group that puts together updates for the survey instrument. So this is something we would really like to explore for the next year.
It's a great question, and it's a perennial challenge. I will say to give the SARE survey credit where it's due. One reason I used this instrument is because its measure of social class was the best I saw in sort of the field. So you'll have lots of surveys that have students self-report family income. Well, good gravy. Nobody knows their dad's salary pre-post taxes, and then that's just so. Lots of error there. And then more and more studies are using first generation status as sort of like a proxy for this, which I guess is better than nothing. Although I will never forget a colleague of mine who worked in admissions at Stanford University and reminded me that Tim McGraw and Faith Hill's child applied to Stanford, and she was technically first gen, right? Because neither of her parents, who were international country music superstars, went to college. So perhaps that's not the most effective measure either. So yeah, I'm not sure. I think the way the question is written on the survey is super helpful. And even still, you get pushback from folks like, well, doesn't everybody just think they're middle class? That didn't seem to be the case on the survey, but it, is something. And as class inequality and widens, it'll be interesting to sort of see how response to that item kind of looks in the future. But yeah, it's tricky. I think ideally you'd like to have a bunch of different measures that you could maybe put together. So a sort of self-assessed social class item, plus asking students maybe about what their parents do for a living. You could maybe put that together with, the high school that they attended. Like ideally you'd want to be able to put a bunch of different measures together to try to get your arms around that. But it's a sticky wicket for sure. It's tricky.
All right, so we have a bunch of questions in chat for you, Kaitlin. So to start, is the help-seeking propensity at all culture-based? Also, is it age-related or by matriculation type, if they enrolled at high school versus transfer? Did you see any? You can also look at the chat if you want more detail.
Yep. I didn't run a ton of crosstabs on this. I do think rates were pretty low sort of across the board. So it increased sort of by year in college, as you might expect. So students that were older or had been in college longer did tend to interact with faculty a little bit more than did students who didn't. But still not at super high rates. So there's something there. In terms of the culture question, that's really interesting. That comes up a lot in the sociology literature, right? That there's this sort of idea that there's a kind of a working class work ethic where like you solve problems on your own, you don't bellyache and cry about it, you try to figure out a solution on your own. And so I think to that end, that's why it's really important to me to try to figure out like, how do we communicate that help seeking is actually a really highly adaptive behavior that the most successful students in college engage and use to their benefit. Help seeking is a type of cultural capital, right? Students who are the most successful use that strategy. And so how do we communicate that to all students to make sure that they're clear and understand that that's what, in the college context, in the college habitus, as Bourdieu would say, help seeking is an appropriate behavior. So, that's something that I think is worth training faculty on, thinking about professional development. How do we socialize students in this specific way? And wow, everybody's stoked on the help seeking stuff. Did the study determine if students had outside commitments such as work or obligations? Yeah, I think I did include that in the overall structural equation model and was really surprised to find a couple of things, which I also think speaks to this culture question. So something I found was that students who worked more hours per week actually interacted with faculty more frequently. Interesting. Transfer students tended to interact with faculty more frequently. Interesting. And international students tended to interact, or non-residents tended to interact with faculty more frequently. And those were kind of three things that typically in the literature are talked about as deficits, right? The, you know, in Tongshan's project, right? Working too much, or, you know, being a transfer student, those are often struggles, conceptualized as struggles for students. But I actually think those findings speak to a certain level of capital that poor and working class students might bring with them. If you're the type of student who has to juggle working a job for pay along with all of your other responsibilities, or if you're a student who has successfully managed the transfer pipeline, which, you know, goodness, I mean, that takes a lot of tenacity to do, then you're probably also a type of student who understands that institutional agents have a role, that faculty are there to help you. And so I was actually really excited to see those findings because I think they demonstrate some real strengths that poor and working class, international transfer, and students who work bring to the table. You know, that they understand maybe how to manage their time a little bit better, and that, you know, they understand that faculty are useful resources for them.
Any final questions? If not, then
lots of interesting, sorry to interrupt, lots of interesting exchanges in the chat. I actually, you know, when I was watching the recordings, I listed a number of questions that I had, and maybe I can ask one, Ana Maria, if I can. I really liked how you compared, because it was part of the items were from Chirikov survey that we administered in 2020, and the same items were administered in Brazil. And it struck me, you know, how similar things are, like in terms of the common challenges for universities. And but one of the things that I think you mentioned that Unicamp introduced is faculty training to be better in online learning. And I know that there were initiatives like that that received a great pushback from faculty in the US. But what about Unicamp? How was they organized?
The faculty training was offered by our Teaching and Learning Center, and I do not have consolidated data about the use of that resource. What I only have anecdotal information, and what I heard from my colleagues is that the university offered a lot of resource, including links, videos, websites with information, some kinds of guides how to use online platforms, but what I heard, and some training courses also. But what I heard, it was the teaching, the faculty was so loaded with the challenge to adapt the subjects and all the activities, and they had only 2 weeks to do that at Unicamp, because Unicamp decided to go online in less than 1 month, when the classes were suspended. And so they were so overwhelmed with all the activities that they used very few of these resources that were available. So the same survey was also applied to faculty, and I don't have the results here, but I could look and discuss another moment, because we can also see the side of the faculty in that moment.
Yeah, that would be great actually to see the differences, how students perceive. And this is to Kaitlin's note about faculty working conditions and student learning conditions.
Well, I think we're at time. Thank you so much to all of our panel speakers. I think I speak for all of us that they were wonderful talks, and it was wonderful to learn more about them and to discuss some of these like key issues. And both, I think an interesting thing that came up is both the student engagement and success side, but also that is just the other side of the coin of like instructional working conditions, and how those two interplay with each other. So thank you all.
Thank you, Beatriz.